Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. Grab your Q branch, trowels, and hose, because it's Gardner time again. Yes, I recently finished the 5th installment in the John Gardner James Bond continuation novels, and if you were tuning into this review expecting it to be like many of the other Gardner reviews, that I'm going to be complaining about contrivances, I'm going to be making fun of certain decisions, I'm going to be guffawing at incomprehensible decisions, then, well, yes, there is indeed going to be some of that, but for the most part, I had a blast with this book. It's actually something of a direct sequel to the previous novel in this series, Roll of Honor, in the sense that, well, the story, the relevant parts of that story for this story are that a man named Tamil Rahani was revealed as being the leader of the criminal organization Spectre, which was previously run by Stavro Blofeld, of course, as you will probably know, and indeed Blofeld's daughter in a previous Gardner book. At the climax of that story, aboard a Goodyear blimp, no, really, go back to my review if you want to hear more about that. So at the end of that story, Tamil Rahani parachutes out of the blimp, and it's kind of a, well, I'll get you next time, Rahani, kind of thing from Bond. So he makes out of that story alive, but it turns out that when he landed, he had a really bad landing, and he did some permanent damage to his own body, like hurt his spine, and now he's like in a really bad shape, and so he wants revenge against James Bond himself. He wants revenge on James Bond for this, so he puts out word to every criminal organization, every hitman, every nefarious group you can think of, that if you capture James Bond and bring him to me, I will award you 10 million Swiss francs. For whatever fun I'm going to be poking at certain story developments as we get into talking about this in a bit more detail, I do just want to say right from the off that I think that this setup is actually quite brilliant, and it's a far cry away from what we've seen in most of the Bond books, Gardner, Fleming, what have you, where it's very much, this is your mission, Bond, and this is the scene with M where you get that mission and whatnot. Here it's very much, MI6 have a presence in the story, but it is mainly Bond kind of out like on his own wits, and he's having to figure out who to trust, who not to trust, and then there's the infighting going on between the villainous groups, like all of these different parties who have their own personal interest in capturing him to get this money, so there's that aspect as well, and I just thought it was a pretty phenomenal setup, really. So for about 2/3 of the story, we're in Europe. Bond is driving around the country, he's on leave, and he is heading to the Clinic Mozart near Salzburg to pick up his housekeeper, May, who has been admitted to the clinic after suffering from a couple of severe bouts of bronchitis. Bond is going to go and pick her up, and all being well with her, take her back to London. You know, I don't know if I've ever actually really talked about May in these book reviews, but she is a recurring character in the series. She was a Fleming invention, she was in those Fleming stories, and she's James Bond's housekeeper. She keeps his flat in good condition while he's away on his various assignments, she makes his meals when he's there and whatnot. She normally just gets like mentioned once or twice. I think maybe in the past she's had a line of dialogue or two. We've been privy to an exchange between her and Bond every once in a while, or he's remembering a conversation that he had with her, something like that, but the reason why I had to think, like, have I even mentioned her in these reviews before, is because she's so kind of not very important, and this is certainly the most important role that she's had in any of the books so far. I get that Gardner is trying to be loyal to the law that Fleming set down, like, you know, May is Bond's housekeeper, he's trying to keep all of these elements and play with them. The thing that feels quite weird is that we're now in the mid-80s, and Bond having a housekeeper in this time period just feels a bit anachronistic to me. And I don't know, maybe people of Bond's standing in the 80s did indeed keep housekeepers. It wasn't anything that I thought twice about when it was talking about the 50s, and, you know, I guess that James Bond does earn a relatively, you know, upper middle class salary. I don't see why he couldn't, you know, afford to have her, but it's just something that the more contemporary you get with it, it's like having, like, servants, basically, is such a, I think of it as a real aristocratic, only very, very well-off people have that, so that just feels a bit odd to me in this setting, that he would still have a nice little Scottish lady milling about his place and making his bed and preparing his eggs. Anyway, she's at the health retreat, Bond's gonna go and pick her up, and bafflingly, Miss Moneypenny is also on leave and also traveling around Europe and just decides to take some time out of her own holiday to visit May, because who among us wouldn't visit the personal staff of a co-worker we barely know? So this is truly a bizarre turn. Like, she's at the clinic and she's phoning Bond, she's talking to Bond on the phone, and they're just having a very casual conversation, just like old pals, like, oh yeah, I'm taking time out of my holiday to visit May, you know, nothing about how May and Moneypenny would have ever come to even know each other. Like, I think Fleming's May doesn't even really know what Bond does for a living, so it's really odd that here it's presented as, oh yes, it's just all one big happy family and we all know each other. Even in this Gardner series, I haven't felt that Bond and Moneypenny, like, know each other particularly well. Certainly in the Flemings, she's mentioned every once in a while, but it's not really like a big deal. It's, again, it's just kind of bizarre that she is here in this scenario. Anyway, the whole conceit of this is to get both of them in the same place so that both May and Moneypenny can be kidnapped. So not only does Bond have a price on his head, literally, but we'll get to that later, he also has to find his housekeeper and work colleague before Spectre do something nefarious with them. Or as the blurb of the version of the book that I have puts it, he must try and save the lives of the two women who matter to him most. Now, May I can kind of appreciate having that designation in Bond's life, but Moneypenny has never been a big thing in the books at all. I mean, she's mentioned in passing most of the time, so it's really odd that she's suddenly elevated to this very important status in Bond's life. If I had to take a stab in the dark, I would say that this was a note from a publisher or some advice that Gardner was given to try and give the kidnapping a bit more weight because, well, for a couple of reasons, I guess. The first probably being that, well, May is very old, and going by her status, her health in this book, a third case of bronchitis is all it's gonna take to put her in a wooden box for good. So I feel like they probably included Moneypenny so that there is someone young there, someone maybe with the rest of their lives ahead of them. And also, I think that it's important to note that Moneypenny is a character that if you hadn't read any previous Bond book before, you would know who Moneypenny was in relation to Bond through the films, and the relationship in the films is so much more prominent than in the books, so I think it would be helpful for a newcomer if, God forbid, this is your first James Bond novel, but you would know that character, even just a familiar understanding of the James Bond character and formula, you would know that character. And there's no real time here, like, it gets off at, like, such a quick pace, there's no real time here to establish May or Moneypenny and what their, previous roles in the series have been, so I feel like just for expediency's sake, just like, alright, these people mean a lot to Bond, and that's what the stakes are here. Anyway, the final bit of crucial setup to talk about for this particular plot is that in these opening chapters, and this is probably the most ridiculous element of the whole setup, but Bond meets a woman by the name of Suki Tempesta, who is an Italian aristocrat, and Bond saves her from an apparent mugging, carjacking thing, and they meet up later on. They're at the same hotel, and both very flirty, but Bond is a bit suspicious of her. Something doesn't seem quite right, but nonetheless, he discovers that they have similar traveling across Europe plans, and so he invites her along for his planned trip to Rome. At first, this is all well and good, but then obviously as the plot goes on, Bond realizes that there's a hit on him, and that May and Moneypenny have been kidnapped, and he's met this woman out of the blue who's acting a bit odd, and one would think that it would be best to get away from her, like, very quickly and very far, but for some reason, Bond still decides to take Suki along for the ride. There's some lip service about how Bond is rationalizing this to himself, and he's like, oh well, you'd make a good hostage, which is contrived to say the least, but beyond that, like, he tells Suki all of this, and she's still like, oh, I'll come along anyway. Oh, by the way, I called my friend Nanny and told her that we'd pick her up, like, the next morning so that she could come along for the trip as well. And Bond's like, well, phone her and tell her that she can't bloody come, which is reasonable. But then Suki's like, oh, well, I'm like, well, I did tell her, this is a bit awkward, I don't want her to be left out in the cold sort of thing. And it's like, this is like a very, prominent, civilized European country that you're in. Like, I'm fairly sure that Nanny can just call a taxi or figure out what to do herself, but anyway. So to be polite and avoid potential awkwardness, Bond accepts this, and so we have Bond, Suki, and Nanny in the car, all heading off to try and save May and Moneypenny. So it turns out that Nanny is actually a part of Nourish Universal Bodyguards. NUB, which is an organization of female bodyguards, and she has been tasked with protecting Suki, though the two of them have a relationship that goes back many years. I'm confounded that after hearing all of this nonsense, Bond is still just okay with them hitching rides, and Gardner must be aware of this, because there are so many passages in this thing where Bond is internal monologuing and reasoning to himself as to why it's a good idea to have these two women he's never met before on a ride when he's literally supposed to not be trusting anyone, but okay. Quite a way into this video, and I've only really been talking about the setup here, but the bulk of the middle of the story is Bond and his two new companions kind of getting caught up with a variety of characters, criminals and friends who may be foes, but you know, some double crossing going on, and it's about how these scenarios play out, and I must admit to having an absolute blast with this. It moves at a great pace, and I think there's some really exciting stuff throughout. Of all the characters that they do meet, my favorite is this dodgy inspector. He's called Heinrich Osten, but he goes by De Hacken, which means the hook, because he uses a hook to torture people. He's not in the book for very long, but his exchanges with Bond are great, and how he leaves the story is, I'll just say that it's really gnarly and horrible, and I thought that Gardner did a really great job with that, and those character bits are really a highlight for me in this. I really enjoyed it. To say that there are a lot of characters in this, and I've definitely complained in the past, I think it was Icebreaker that just had so many double crossings and so many kind of switching sides and allegiance changing that it got a bit confusing, and indeed in the last book, Roll of Honor, I felt like there were far too many characters in that. In this one, I feel like I'm not overwhelmed with characters. I feel like they're all quite well defined and they serve their purpose for the story. Very well judged, I thought. There is another bit in these middle parts of the book that I think is going to stick with me forever. It's an assassination attempt on Bond. There are a few attempts at his life, but this one is just like, right, so he's in a hotel, he goes in for a shower, and he gets a feeling that there's something in the bathroom with him, and then this giant vampire bat attacks him in the shower, and the door of the bathroom is jammed from the other side, so he can't actually get out, and he has to kill the thing, and he talks about whacking it, and it made me think of that bit in Dr. No where he's whacking the tarantula to death. And it's just really funny because Gardner has to go to great lengths to explain why Bond has to kill the bat rather than just open a window and let the poor thing out. But he's monologuing because he's like, oh, it probably has some awful tropical virus and I can't risk it biting me, so I need to beat the life out of it. And sure enough, later on in the story, they revisit this. Like, I you know, a few chapters down the line, I thought, well, that's the last we're hearing about this vampire bat. But no, they do, like, actually go on about it a bit later on and say, oh, yes, well, it was actually specially bred to have some kind of bizarre tropical disease that was going to kill you, Mr. Bond. So he gets out of the bathroom, and then Suki is there in his room, and she's like, oh, the door was jammed from the other side, and she's kind of taking all of this in her stride. And then she's like, oh, this reminds you of the pranks that Nanny pulls on me all the time. And I'm like, I don't think that locking someone in the bathroom and putting a bat in their shower is like a fairly common way of pranking people. Anyway, there's a bunch of double crossings and whatnot, and it all kind of comes down to Bond discovers that May and Moneypenny are being held at Rahani's Spectre base in Florida. He heads there and he's joined in Florida by Suki and Nanny, and how the warning sirens aren't deafening the man by now, I'll never know, because they're both just like, oh, well, James, we're all in this together now. Yes, we'll travel across the world with you to save these women we don't know. And it's like, no, bugger off. One of you or both of you are clearly gonna double cross me, but this just, anyway. Bond has to find some scuba gear to go on this mission to get to Spectre Island, and there's this absolutely great bit where he's going through the water with his scuba gear and he's fending off a shark at one point, which I thought was actually really well written. I thought that it was really well described. Anyway, he gets to Rahani, who is very much on his deathbed, and he's kind of a husk of a man, and Bond is about to kill him, and lo and behold, Nanny appears, and it turns out that she's a part of the Spectre plan all along. And this cues pretty much an entire chapter where Gardner has to fill in any potential plot holes and logic holes as a result of this development, because there are a fair few passages of Bond being like, well, wait a minute, Nanny, if you're working for Spectre, why did you help me out of that situation earlier on? And why did you kill that person and all this kind of stuff? Why did you leave Suki alive? And it's all filled in relatively contrived ways, but nonetheless, Bond is taken to a dungeon where May and Moneypenny are also being locked up, and he sees that Spectre plans to assassinate him via guillotine. This is such a fun setup, I think. Like, they have this proper French-style guillotine there, and Rahani has arranged to come down to the basement, and he's going to watch James Bond be beheaded, and then they have silverware waiting so that Bond's head can be put on it and presented to the dying villain on a platter, but Bond is able to escape his cell when no one is watching, and then he tampers with Rahani can barely move, and he's got one of those hospital beds that, you know, it's an electronic thing where you can buzz it up and down and sit up and down on it. So Bond does some tinkering with this bed, and when Rahani requests to be lifted up to watch Bond die, the bed explodes, which causes a panic. So Bond is able to kill the other Spectre guards. Nanny is, I assume, killed in this bit. I mean, she's kind of like diving for a gun at one point, and her arms go, I think it's both of her arms, or one of her arms go through the guillotine thing, and Bond sets off the guillotine, which cuts off her arms, which is good, gory fun, and then Bond rescues May and Moneypenny and muses about, could this be the end of Spectre once and for all? Well, got another, 10 books in this Gardner series? I guess we'll find out. Anyway, it turns out that Suki Tempesta was clean and honest and decent all along, so Bond is able to gallivant around with her, and that's kind of how the story ends. For as much fun as I had with this book, and I honestly think that this is the best Gardner book I've read so far, I really enjoyed it, I had an absolute blast with it. It does absolutely nothing to redeem the very poor and shallow characterization of Tamil Rahani from the previous book. I have no idea who this guy is, and he's supposed to be the leader of all the villains, the head of Spectre. Like, he should be a Blofeld, he should have the presence of that, but he just doesn't. The story feels like it's really missing a really good, like, big bad villain for Bond to defeat at the end. I guess in ways it ends up kind of being Nanny, but she's another character who her and Suki are really oddly written. They're kind of, I want to say kooky, and Nanny in particular, like, and I don't know if this was just, like, because her name is actually Nanny, it's not her title, and because I'm obviously so used to, when I see or read Nanny, I think of, you know, a lady who looks after kids or whatever, so in my head, she's kind of this, like, older lady, like Betty Davis in The Nanny, and she's got all these kind of, I don't know how to describe it, just really eccentric lines and just, oh, pip pip, Mr. Bond, got your gun there, sort of thing. It's very odd. But that being said, it didn't detract from my enjoyment of this that much. I mean, when it comes down to my Gardner ranking, this one is going straight in at the top. I thought it moved along at a rollicking pace. I thought it was very exciting in a lot of places, very funny in places too, and perhaps not intentionally funny, but I was never bored at least. I had a blast going through it, and compared with the previous ones, which I thought have kind of, you know, straddled the line between bland and confusing more often than not, this really re-energized my appetite for these Gardner books, actually. If any more of them can just be fun little bits of pulp like this one, then I'll be very pleased. It's very short too. It was like, what, just over 180 pages. I went through this really quickly. I thought it was really fun and exciting. So you know what, I don't know if I would necessarily recommend reading all of the Gardner books in order, but if you're just curious about, you know, dipping your toe into the Gardner waters, then you know, this one might not be a bad one to check out. Anyway, please do let me know your own thoughts on this one in the comments section below. Is my enthusiasm too unfounded, and is this actually considered to be one of the worst ones? I love reading the comments of these Gardner books, and I think I've said before, because I guess not everyone goes back and revisits them, so it's kind of hard to, you know, you can't necessarily go on the BuzzFeed and see, like, oh, all the James Bond Gardner books rank from best to worst kind of stuff. There isn't that much online chatter about them and whatnot, so it's always exciting to hear comments from other people who've read them. And if you have enjoyed this video and want to stay up to date on future video uploads that I make on this channel, then please do consider scrolling below and clicking the subscribe button. And then, of course, there is also the Mrs. Bell notification button if you want to stay super up to date and get notifications about when I upload a new video. Also below are links to my various social media pages, including my Facebook page, my Twitter page, my Patreon page, my Instagram page, and what the hell, I'm just gonna leave my Letterboxd page down there so you can follow me on there if you want to see my thoughts about movies other than Bond occasionally. And with all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.